The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a storm. It was a sweltering summer afternoon in Fresno, California, and the room was packed with onlookers, reporters, and family members. All eyes were fixed on Judge Henry Caldwell, a man known for his no-nonsense demeanor and unshakable rulings. At 64 years old, with over 35 years on the bench, Caldwell's face bore the lines of a man who had seen it all. His reputation for delivering swift, firm justice was well earned, and today was no exception. The defendant, 25-year-old Marcus Reed, stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze steady. He wore the expression of someone who had spent a lifetime trying to prove himself. Marcus had always maintained his innocence, even during his arrest for the armed robbery of a high-end jewelry store that left one employee critically injured. But today, his voice wouldn't matter. "Mr. Reed," Judge Caldwell began, his deep voice resonating through the courtroom, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not only reckless, but calculated, and you have shown no remorse." Marcus's mother, seated in the back row, stifled a sob. She had begged the court to see her son as more than a case number, to consider the boy she had raised, the boy who once dreamed of becoming an architect. But the evidence had spoken louder. Eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that had sealed his fate. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," Judge Caldwell declared, his gavel striking the oak block with a sound that echoed like a death knell. Marcus stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line as if holding back words he knew would never change anything. The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and the frantic scribbling of reporters. But for Marcus, the world had gone silent. He turned to look at his mother one last time before being led away, his shackled footsteps fading down the hall. Judge Caldwell returned to his chambers, shutting the door against the noise. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid as if it held some answer. The day had been long, but justice, as he saw it, had been served. Or so he thought. Little did he know, the truth he had just buried would soon claw its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. The trial had been one for the books. Local news outlets dubbed it the Reed robbery case, and it dominated headlines for weeks. The crime itself was a spectacle. A masked gunman storming into Harrison's Jewelers in downtown Fresno on a busy Thursday afternoon, brandishing a weapon and making off with over $200,000 in stolen goods. The chaos left one store clerk, Daniel Harris, fighting for his life after being struck in the crossfire. Marcus Reed, a part-time mechanic with no prior criminal record, had been arrested 2 weeks after the robbery. An anonymous caller had tipped off authorities, claiming Marcus fit the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution painted a damning picture, connecting him to the stolen goods recovered from a storage unit registered under his name. Marcus's court-appointed defense attorney struggled to make headway against the mountain of evidence. Grainy surveillance footage showing a man with a similar build and gait, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized Marcus's voice, and, perhaps most incriminating of all, fingerprints found on the weapon left behind at the scene. Still, Marcus maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he told the jury during his testimony. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." His alibi, a claim that he was working a double shift at the auto shop that day, crumbled under scrutiny when his boss admitted on the stand that he couldn't verify Marcus's whereabouts for the full day. The prosecution's closing arguments were sharp and unforgiving. "This is a man who thought he could outsmart the law," the district attorney declared, pacing before the jury. "But the evidence doesn't lie. The fingerprints don't lie. The witnesses don't lie." In contrast, Marcus's defense felt feeble, almost defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his lawyer pleaded, "there are holes in this case. Doubts. Isn't that enough to give this young man the benefit of the doubt?" But his voice lacked conviction, and the jury wasn't swayed. The deliberation was swift, less than 3 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Marcus didn't flinch as the foreperson read the decision, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm brewing inside. Judge Caldwell, impartial as ever, prepared himself to deliver a sentence he felt was justified. He had seen hardened criminals in his courtroom, men who had mastered the art of manipulation. To him, Marcus was no different. His gaze swept the courtroom before landing on Marcus, as if searching for any sign of remorse or redemption. When the sentence was handed down, it was as if the room itself exhaled. For the victims and their families, there was relief. For Marcus and his mother, devastation. The system had spoken, and it was unforgiving. But as Judge Caldwell signed the sentencing papers later that evening, a faint flicker of something unsettled him, a nagging sense he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. What Judge Caldwell couldn't know was that the trial had been just the beginning. The real story was waiting for him, hidden in plain sight, and it was about to change everything. It started on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. Judge Caldwell sat in his study, the warm glow of a desk lamp illuminating the cluttered stacks of legal briefs and case files. Retirement had been on his mind lately, but tonight there was work to be done. A new case involving police misconduct had landed on his desk, and the allegations were serious enough to warrant extra attention. As he thumbed through the documents, something caught his eye. An evidence log from a prior investigation. At first, it was just a passing glance, a meaningless detail in the sea of paperwork. But then a name leapt out at him. Marcus Reed. Caldwell sat back in his chair, frowning. It wasn't unusual for names to resurface in unrelated cases, but this felt different. He flipped the page, his pulse quickening. The log detailed the inventory of a police evidence locker, listing items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had taken place around the same time as the Harrison's jewelers case. One item stood out, a gun. The description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Marcus had been convicted. The problem? This gun hadn't been submitted as evidence during Marcus's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Caldwell leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial documents still fresh in his memory. It was an exact match, same make, same scratches on the barrel. But the report claimed this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. How is that possible? He muttered under his breath. His heart raced as he pieced together the implications. If this gun had been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the Harrison's jewelers robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints were on it? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Caldwell had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, and he knew how easily critical details could be buried. But this wasn't a mistake. It felt intentional. Determined to get answers, he requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. It arrived the next morning, a thick folder brimming with police reports, photographs, and witness statements. The deeper Caldwell dug, the more the threads began to unravel. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was the same detective who had testified during Marcus's trial. And then there was the anonymous tip. Caldwell had barely given it a second thought during the trial, but now it seemed glaringly suspicious. He requested a subpoena for the tip line records, his unease growing with every passing hour. When the documents finally arrived, Caldwell's blood ran cold. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had originated from a burner phone registered under the same detective's name. The walls of his office seemed to close in as the realization hit him. Marcus Reed had been set up. The evidence had been manipulated, the testimony orchestrated. Caldwell's stomach churned as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down, the shattered life of a young man who might have been innocent all along. Caldwell had always prided himself on upholding the law, but now the law felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, but the path forward was fraught with peril. As the weight of his discovery settled, Caldwell made a choice. He would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The truth demanded it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The community's support was a double-edged sword. It empowered her, but it also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then, one day, her attorney called with news. The officer she was suing had filed a motion to dismiss the case. Evelyn expected as much. It was a standard move to delay the process. But as her attorney explained the next steps, she froze. "Evelyn," he said cautiously, "you should know something else. You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The irony was staggering. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, processing the revelation. She had spent weeks preparing to fight these officers in court, and now fate had handed her an entirely different kind of justice. For a moment she wondered if she could do it, if she could sit on that bench and remain impartial. But then she thought about everything they had put her through, about the people depending on her to make a stand. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was an opportunity to show what real justice looked like. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as people filed in, finding their seats. The case was nothing particularly high profile, an internal misconduct hearing involving 2 officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. To most, it was just another day in the justice system. The 2 officers, Officer Harris and Officer Mitchell, sat at the defendant's table wearing their uniforms like armor. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low tones, their expressions indifferent, almost bored. To them this was routine, another hurdle to clear, another case to brush aside. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened and the room fell silent. Evelyn stepped onto the bench, her black robe flowing behind her. She moved with purpose, her expression calm yet commanding. As she took her seat, she glanced toward the defendants. The reaction was immediate. Officer Harris's face drained of color, his eyes widening in shock. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process what he was seeing. It was her, the woman they had humiliated and arrested at the park. Evelyn allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began the proceedings. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The officers sat stiffly, their composure faltering. Harris whispered something to their lawyer, who nodded but kept his focus on Evelyn. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt the upper hand. But she knew this wasn't about revenge. Her job as a judge demanded impartiality, and she would uphold that standard. Still, the irony wasn't lost on her, or anyone else in the room. As the attorneys presented their opening arguments, Evelyn maintained her professionalism, listening intently and taking notes. But every so often, her gaze would flicker toward the officers. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands fidgeted slightly. During a recess, Harris and Mitchell stepped into the hallway, their voices low but agitated. "How is she the judge?" Harris hissed, his frustration barely contained. "This has to be a setup." Mitchell muttered, shaking his head. "It's not a setup," their lawyer interjected. "It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused. She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But the officers weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Evelyn remained composed, ensuring the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. Yet her presence alone seemed to unsettle the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence eroding little by little. At one point, during witness testimony, Evelyn caught Harris stealing a glance at her. His expression wasn't defiance, it was something closer to regret, as if he was beginning to understand the gravity of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Evelyn adjourned the hearing, her gavel striking with finality. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, Evelyn lingered at her bench, organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of the officers' stares as they hesitated by the door, clearly debating whether to approach her. In the end, they didn't. They left quietly, their steps heavy with the realization that this was far from over. But for Evelyn, the real challenge wasn't in the irony of the moment. It was in the decisions that would follow, and whether justice could truly prevail. The courtroom was packed the next morning. News of the unexpected twist had spread, drawing a larger crowd than usual for a misconduct hearing. Some were there out of curiosity, others to support Evelyn, though they knew her role as the judge meant she couldn't show favoritism. Evelyn entered with the same calm, composed demeanor, her robe flowing as she ascended to the bench. The attorneys wasted no time diving into their arguments. The prosecutor methodically laid out evidence against the officers, presenting testimony from the victim of the excessive force incident. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment. They were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect." Evelyn nodded, taking in every word, her pen gliding across her notepad. Her focus was unshakable, even as the defendants shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. The defense attorney rose to counter, his tone measured but strained. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures." As the arguments continued, Evelyn couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience. The excuses, the justifications, it was all too familiar. Yet she pushed her personal feelings aside, determined to let the facts guide her. When it was time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room deepened. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Jake. His voice trembled as he recounted the night he was tackled to the ground by the officers during a routine traffic stop. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain," Jake said, his eyes darting nervously between the attorneys and the officers. "It felt like they decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth." The prosecutor pressed further. "And did you resist their orders at any point?" "No," Jake replied firmly. "I was scared, but I did everything they said. It didn't matter. They had already made up their minds." The room was silent as the defense attorney stood to cross-examine. He tried to poke holes in Jake's testimony, but the young man held his ground. Evelyn watched intently, her expression unreadable. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Harris was the first to take the stand. He glanced nervously at Evelyn as he swore the oath, his voice shaky as he answered the prosecutor's questions. "Officer Harris," the prosecutor began, "you've been accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night?" Harris hesitated, his gaze darting toward Mitchell before answering. I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call." "And do you believe your actions were justified?" Harris shifted in his seat. "At the time, yes, but looking back, I could have handled it differently." The prosecutor pressed on. "Handled it differently how? By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground?" Harris opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence spoke volumes. When it was Mitchell's turn to testify, his demeanor was similarly strained. His attempts to justify his actions only deepened the prosecutor's case, highlighting the officer's inability to take accountability. Evelyn listened closely, her face betraying no emotion. But inside, she felt a mixture of frustration and pity. These men had been given authority, yet they wielded it recklessly, leaving a trail of harm in their wake. As the day wore on, it became clear that the evidence against the officers was overwhelming. The prosecutor's closing argument was powerful, urging the court to set a precedent that abuse of power would not be tolerated. When the defense delivered its closing statement, it was clear they were grasping at straws. Their arguments lacked conviction, and even the officers seemed resigned to the likely outcome. Evelyn adjourned the hearing, her voice steady, as she announced that a ruling would be delivered the following week. As the courtroom emptied, Harris and Mitchell lingered near the exit, their faces pale and drawn. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the gravity of their actions and the reality of what awaited them. But justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about accountability, change, and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. A week later, the courtroom was silent as Evelyn entered to deliver her ruling. Every seat was filled, the tension almost tangible.